They escaped famine and death in Ireland to begin a new life in Boston, Massachusetts. A life of wealth, privilege, and power.
My fellow citizens of the world.
From Irish peasantry to American royalty, these are the Kennedys. Their relationships with each other have impacted both America and the world. With triumph and glory comes scandal and tragedy.
Something has happened here.
From one generation to the next, the Kennedys are more than a family. They are the great American dynasty.
America's new ambassador to Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, faces a battery of cameras and cameramen as he's about to depart for St. James's Court.
When President Roosevelt sends Joseph P. Kennedy in 1938 across the Atlantic to be the ambassador to the United Kingdom, he was a star, a celebrity. He had run a studio in Hollywood, and he was already a success in business and politics. He was among the top 20 richest men in America. It was big news.
The rise of Joseph Kennedy is as remarkable as it is seemingly unstoppable.
Joe Kennedy came from an Irish family, and they worked their way from the bottom to the top. They were outsiders.
His grandparents came during the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s to Boston. So the family is just 2 generations removed from the peasantry of Ireland.
Mr. Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador, left for Buckingham Palace to present his credentials to the king.
Having an Irish Catholic in that job, it was just like the perfect victory in the struggle of my grandfather to feel accepted.
And as for me, I'm delighted to be here.
You cannot underestimate Joseph Kennedy's ambition in 1938.
My grandfather had ambitions, right, to be president himself.
And what do you think he finds all England interested in? What about the family, Mr. Kennedy?
Joseph and Rose Kennedy have 9 children. From their oldest, Joseph Jr., to their youngest, Ted. The Kennedys aren't just any family. They're a family on a mission.
Kennedys to the left of them, Kennedys to the right of them. So England's cameramen work overtime to picture America's new ambassador to Britain with his 9 children.
They lined up before the newsreel cameras.
With him come Joseph Jr., age 22, and John, age 21.
Smiled. Everybody had something to say.
This is my first trip to Europe, and I was very excited. I couldn't even sleep last night.
There's all these quotes from newspapers saying, "We got 11 ambassadors for the price of one," or something.
Pett's Corner at the London Zoo is opened by the Masters Kennedy, who quickly get on sympathetic terms with the animals.
So the whole family was accepted with a lot of buzz.
The Kennedys understand, before any other American family, the role of glamour. And until now, glamour is something that's really the province of Hollywood. The Kennedys pull it over into the province of politics, really for the first time in a modern way. And as a result, everybody is in love with this family.
The Kennedy family really represented America on the rise, an immigrant country where anybody could get ahead if they were smart enough, if they were ambitious enough. People would look at the Kennedy and they would see the American dream.
There's a moment when Joe and Rose, his beautiful wife, are at Windsor Castle with the King and Queen. And Joe says, "Rose, we've come a hell of a long way from East Boston."
Joseph Kennedy grew up in a Boston in which Protestant patricians looked down on the Irish. So he was constantly fighting those prejudices, aware of those prejudices.
Our family were immigrants, and my grandmother used to tell stories about how she would pass signs as a little girl saying, "No Irish need apply." And you should never underestimate the "I'll show you" motive in history.
Joe Kennedy's insecurity about being an Irish Catholic fed his drive and his ambition, and he was going to prove to people that he was as good as they thought that he wasn't.
Joe was a marvelous, a master businessman, deal maker, stock manipulator.
My mother, in honor of his birthday, made this wonderful flag of a bear because he was the bear of Wall Street. He shorted Wall Street, you know. He was such a force.
He's a rogue. He's a little dodgy. He's a bit of a bad boy, and he's terrifically successful.
Joseph Kennedy tells his children, and tells Rose over and over and over again, "I am making all this money so my children don't have to. So my boys and my girls can go into public service."
Thank you very much for asking me to speak.
Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy is an astute matriarch and equally as ambitious for her children.
Rose Kennedy had an extraordinarily refined political mind, which is not surprising. She came from a political family, and her father was the mayor of Boston.
You want me to talk? Where do I talk in here?
The dinner table was always as much about current events as it was about food. They had to be able to explain what was going on in the world, and they had to be able to do it in an articulate way.
I kid you not, my grandmother Rose would have famous quotations pinned to her sweaters. And if the conversation ever lagged, she'd start memorizing her famous quotations because she said, "You never know. Somebody might ask to give you a speech and you'd have to say something appropriate."
Rose Kennedy is deeply religious. They're one of the most prominent Catholic families. They go to the Pope's coronation. Most of that is coming from Rose.
She trained her children how to be good Catholics, and she trained her sons to be leaders, her daughters to raise lots of Catholic children.
Joe Kennedy was phenomenally ambitious to be rich. He had achieved that. He has a beautiful family, and he's America's representative to the Court of St. James. But he wanted to be president of the United States.
As war clouds gather over Europe, a shadow is cast over Joseph P. Kennedy's dreams.
What's clear is that Joseph P. Kennedy ends up on the wrong side of history in a dramatic way.
I've been asked by the newspaper man this afternoon what the chances were of appeasement. I said I didn't know what they were, but they certainly were worth trying.
As America's ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy is desperate to prevent war between Great Britain and Nazi Germany.
He's concerned that if the British go to war, the United States will go to war. He believes that war is ruinous to a country's finances.
Joe Kennedy talked about how the best role for America was to remain neutral, and the best role in terms of the Nazis was to appease them, work with them, somehow not have to go to war against them.
He believed that he could make a deal with Hitler, and that Hitler was a rational politician and statesman. And in this, he was very, very, very wrong.
He never saw the moral challenge that Hitler posed.
I have to tell you now, this country is at war with Germany.
Once war broke out, Ambassador Kennedy wailed, "It's the end of everything."
Kennedy is convinced the Hitler war machine is unstoppable. England will simply be devoured.
Almost as soon as Britain goes to war, Joe decides that he's going to send the children home.
The U.S. line of Washington brings home the biggest group of refugees. Among returning notables are Mrs. Joseph P. Kennedy and children.
My wife and I have given 9 hostages to fortune. Our children and your children are more important than anything else in the world.
Joseph is called a coward for his decision to send his family home. For his opposition to the war, he is branded a Nazi sympathizer.
Roosevelt privately called Kennedy a fascist.
And once Britain was in war, fighting back, and Joe was still trying to appease, he was too outspoken, and he was called back to Washington. President Roosevelt did not want to appease. Roosevelt wanted to fight. And the last thing that FDR needed was an appeaser as ambassador to Great Britain.
Nothing to say until I've seen the president.
So he was finished.
Got it? We're going to throw the bag. You have to leave right now.
Joseph Kennedy goes from being a legitimate power broker in the United States and a player in international politics to being a pariah.
When he crashed and burned as ambassador to Great Britain, that not only cost him his job, it cost him his notion that he could become president. And almost from the moment that he realized that he couldn't do it, the aspiration was his kids would do it.
Joseph passes his ambitions on to Joe Jr., Kathleen, known as Kick, and Jack. He calls them his golden trio.
His eldest son, Joe Jr., was not only handsome, but also athletically gifted. He was the heir apparent. Joe Jr.'s father and mother believed that he would be the one to carry the standard for the family.
His younger son, Jack, is overshadowed by Joe Jr. in his father's mind, but I think having a bit lower expectation gave Jack a chance to be himself. It gave him a kind of freedom to be a kid in a way that I think it would have been tougher for Joe Jr.
Jack and Kathleen were the closest. They were both troublemakers. They were both fun, mischievous, and they had each other's backs. She was very popular among boys, and it was because she was vivacious and she was charming and she was funny and she spoke back and she had opinions. She did sort of stand out.
As America enters the war, Joseph seizes an opportunity to restore the Kennedy name.
Once the United States was in war, he was smart enough to know there was no stopping them. They were going to go in. That was the patriotic thing to do. Sure enough, Joe Kennedy helped them.
Air Cadet Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. reports for preliminary training.
Joe Kennedy was the oldest son and therefore the most beholden to please Dad. And Joe Kennedy wanted Joe Jr. to be president of the United States.
Now it's a front seat in America's defense for a young man who saw what happened over there.
Unlike Joe, Jack was not dutiful. He had a little bit of a rebellious streak, gallivanting around, chasing girls. He was also sick a lot.
When Jack is 2 years old, he contracts scarlet fever, and he is basically sick for the rest of his life. Fallen arches, bad knees, chronic colds, you name it, he had it.
Jack gets an office job in the Navy Intelligence Service because Jack is disabled in any number of ways. It's during that office job that he takes up with a woman.
She's a Danish journalist called Inga Arvard. They have this very intense affair, and the problem was that the FBI were recording some of these romantic sessions.
Inga Arvad was a great beauty, but she was allegedly a German spy, and that made it a bit awkward.
Jack Kennedy is in naval intelligence. Is Nazi intelligence trying to take advantage of the Kennedys to learn secrets? The FBI decides to let Joseph Kennedy know what Jack was up to with Inga Arvad.
He thought that in his son's best interest, it was important for him to go to a war zone to wind this thing up.
Realizing Jack's womanizing could further damage the family name, Joseph intervenes to get him posted to the South Pacific. With Joe Jr. training as a bomber pilot, 2 of his golden trio are now in the line of fire.
Joe and Rose raised their children with the sense that they were superhuman, invulnerable, golden children, and they felt that nothing was ever going to happen to them.
But the Kennedys are harboring a painful family secret.
From a young age, Rosemary, the eldest Kennedy daughter, was a bit slow.
She was diagnosed with learning disability at the age of about 6 or 7.
It's the moment when, as a debutante, she is presented at court. And this year, that thrill was experienced by Miss Rosemary Kennedy, daughter of the American ambassador.
Her mother decides that she should have time at home with tutors to help teach her how to try to keep up with the other children in a way that's very modern.
The standard practice is that they would be sent to an institution, and Grandpa and Grandma said, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep Rosemary at home. We're going to raise her with her other siblings.
As she hit puberty, Rosemary goes to being somebody who is quite uncontrollable. There are sexual urges, and she's found with men. She's so vulnerable. It would be very easy for men to take advantage of her.
Mr. Kennedy in particular was afraid she would get pregnant or she'd get a disease. And what were they to do?
They had tried together to find every conceivable cure for Rosemary. None of them worked.
Joe Kennedy read about this brand new procedure called the free frontal lobotomy, only done on people with the most serious physical and mental conditions, never on somebody like Rosemary.
Joe was convinced Rosemary's lobotomy would somehow fix things, and then miraculously she would become a perfect Kennedy like all the other Kennedys.
In the Kennedy family, Joe made the serious decisions, and Rose let him do that.
And so without consulting Rosemary's mother or Rosemary herself, he decides that this is the procedure that she should have done.
The surgeon